Throughout history, storytelling has been a rare constant. Some of our most iconic stories were told centuries ago and managed to spread throughout the world. Stories like Cinderella, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, Frankenstein, Oedipus Rex, the Iliad, and Ben-Hur. Stories have a strong staying power and can define generations and fill the reader with a sense of nostalgia. Then, so many stories surpass generations and become classics. To say that stories are valuable and have an impact on the world as a whole would be an understatement, and it is clear that storytelling is something permanent. We have told stories, we tell stories, and we will continue to tell stories as long as humanity is still around. While storytelling can be as simple as relaying a Friday night to a friend, there's another form of storytelling that I'd like to focus on. Media storytelling. The way I see it, we have four main types of media storytelling: books, movies, plays, and video games. And while there is some overlay, all of these storytelling styles can tell stories in a way that the others can't. We see a lot of successful books to movies, like the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter series, which are two of my personal favorites. But then others fail, like the Percy Jackson series. That's because the Percy Jackson series, as well as many other series, just work better as books. And this extends to comic books as well, like Calvin and Hobbes, where the author refused to let the series become a movie because he believed it would be unnecessary and not live up to the books. You could even argue that movies like Lord of the Rings, while successful, great, and true to the books, worked better as books. The way the stories were told were fundamentally different, and the books were much slower and more detailed than the movies. Then there are movies like Avengers Endgame that are great movies, but nobody would argue that it'd be better as a book. As for plays, well, plays are a lot more interesting because so many plays have great movie adaptations like My Fair Lady or The Sound of Music. The big thing we've noticed with these movies is that they're basically just the play recorded on a camera. And finally, for video games. Well, where do I start? Video games might have the most variety in storytelling. Games like Celeste and Undertale are drastically different, but both stories would only be effective as games. And we also see games like The Last of Us Part 2 that in many ways try to mimic movie visuals and storytelling. Uncharted 4, as well as many other games, give motion blur options to the camera to make it seem more like a film camera. And there's so much to unpack here that I don't even know where to begin. So let's start at the beginning. Super Mario Bros. For the NES. The story of that game was that you needed to jump through the world to save the princess from an evil turtle. Well, actually, that's the story for basically every Mario game. Even then, this form of storytelling works best as a game. You're the one making the jumps, it's you who needs to save the princess. Games were so focused on making you feel like the hero. Although the games back then did have story elements, the focus was always on giving you an excuse to jump and crush enemies, and it was a ton of fun. Fast forwarding, we see games evolve in many different ways. The Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games gave players a huge world with deep backstories and engaging plots. The SNES really saw the rise of JRPGs like the Mana series. These games became well known for having really long and elaborate plots that would last over many hours. And this was entirely unique from movies and plays that would tell a story in just a few hours' time. In a way, these stories were most similar to those of books, that we could take many hours to read through to get the complete story. Right now, we're seeing the rise of great storytelling in video games. We have big-name games like Marvel's Spider-Man or Death Stranding that gives us these great stories. Spider-Man also had absolutely fantastic characters that really made the story feel engaging and cohesive. Then there are other smaller games like Celeste and Undertale, as I mentioned earlier. The indie scene is home to so many of these great story-focused games. To the Moon, Golf Story, The Way, Okami, that doesn't count, and Grease, which I'll get to a bit later. All of these games tell stories in a very unique way, yet all of them work best as video games. So what is it? What makes a good video game narrative? Well, it's not an easy question to answer. Video games can often be, and are usually encouraged to be longer than any movie or play. That means that the pacing and arcs are almost entirely different. Most media follows the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution format. And this works pretty well between storytelling outlets. The exposition would be the character in their humble beginnings. The rising action would be the character getting involved in some odd conflict. The climax is when it seems impossible for the character to win. The falling action is when the character starts to realize that there is a path to victory and things start to fall in place for them as they take their final steps. The resolution is when things finally come to a close. We see this formula everywhere, from The Lord of the Rings to Toy Story to Xenoblade Chronicles 2. However, when it comes to books and video games specifically, there seem to be many more points on that graph. Xenoblade 2 opens with the exposition of Alrest, where Rex is just an average salvager. Then we see him meet the characters that would soon be his adversaries, but everything still seems okay. Eventually we get to the absolute rising action as we see two different motives clash. However, the next step isn't the climax, but rather changing action. Their goal remains the same, but there's so much that they discover and get involved in that their journey is not just a clear path. By the time the climax truly hits, things look a lot different, and it's evident that we are still a long ways away from the falling action. The falling action doesn't really come until you're very near the end of the game, and even though it doesn't follow the normal arc, it's still very effective. Now, people also talk about 3-act stories. This is very common for movies and books, where we have the exposition in the first act. The second act is where we see the conflict unfold and reach its climax. And this is usually the longest part of the story by a good margin. Then, the third act takes the falling action and resolution. Almost every movie you will ever watch follows its structure, though it's not completely universal. Some movies, like Pulp Fiction, for example, did not live by these rules. One of the keys behind a good video game narrative is how it serves the gameplay. Being able to actually control the hero is completely unique to video games, so it's something that needs to be taken advantage of. Super Mario games consistently give you similar plots as an excuse to jump into the gameplay, which is always great. However, this does not exempt it from telling structured stories. Super Mario Odyssey is the clearest of the bunch. The story starts with a fight against Bowser where you end up in the Cap Kingdom, and that's where the exposition starts. As you make your way through, you fall into a loop where you're chasing Bowser and Peach, which leads to some well done cutscenes and some logic behind your destinations. Then the game throws some curveballs like the Ruined Kingdom that is super small but gives you an awesome boss fight. The game doesn't tell a detailed story, but it does always manage to keep you on your toes. Other games give you some time to focus on the characters. Dragon Quest XI is a masterclass in this. The game gives you so many character moments and campfire scenes where you can just freely talk with the other people in your party. You're on some long and epic adventure with them, and you get to lay down and talk casually with them every once in a while. By the end of the game, you've become well acquainted with them all. In many respects, this is like being a part of the Fellowship of the Rings. You're part of this ragtag team who joins together and ends up becoming friends. And in Dragon Quest XI, the group dynamic is wonderful. Now, not all storytelling in video games is narrative-based. World building is another huge factor, and this is where I get to talk about games like Greece, Stardew Valley, and Breath of the Wild. Greece is one of my all-time favorites in this regard. The world is depressing and cold, but there's still some warmth there if you can find it. The few friends you meet, the visuals, and the overpowering music. The game will often put you in very specifically designed sequences that are wholly uplifting and magical. The turtle scene, where you're swimming away from a turtle, is one of the most emotionally resonant scenes that I've experienced between all storytelling mediums. It legit brought me to tears, and you have to play the game to understand how impactful it truly is. Stardew Valley, on the other hand, is my favorite game of all time, and it has another unique way of world building. Pelican Town is a wonderful and charming place, and much like Dragon Quest XI, a lot of the game is spent talking with the citizens and growing relationships with them, which is fantastic. You almost immediately feel like a part of the town, and you get to integrate into it over years of in-game time. It is the world building for the long haul. Exploring the world and finding secrets or items that you can use to better your farm or friendship is magical. Then, Breath of the Wild has the most clear-cut world building. The amount of lore at play is insane. Putting you into this huge and detailed world with just yourself manages to give you emotions of loneliness as you discover parts of the world. There's so many statues and historic landmarks that are always fascinating, and coming across a memory gives you even more insight into this world. Hyrule has fallen in Breath of the Wild, and you get to see how this impacts the people through different villages and paths. Terry Town would probably be the most resonant example of this. If it's not clear, video games can give you very specific emotions. Breath of the Wild masters loneliness, Celeste makes you feel euphoric, and Undertale makes you feel guilty. The capability of forming emotions has actually become almost controversial over the years. Many would argue, myself included, that games should be fun. This leads to the argument, myself not included, that games with somber and depressing stories prevent you from having fun. Specifically, I'm referring to Spec Ops: The Line and its infamous white phosphorus scene that made so many players quit. The scene sets out to stab you in the heart and twist the knife. It's much more than a sad scene, but it leads to some great character development. The question is, does this scene make or break the game? On one hand, it brings out the emotion it tends to, and one that is very hard to expose. But on the other hand, it's so strong and overwhelming that it almost feels unfair or makes people feel so hoarded that they don't want to play anymore. This question of quality isn't for me to answer. But lately, the same controversy has come to The Last of Us Part 2, which takes bold risks that turned some players off. People were very quick to throw shame on this game, but others lauded it with praise. If the developers don't take risks, then games will become stagnant. Risks are absolutely worth taking, especially when it comes to the way the story plays out. I think it's unfair to criticize games like The Last of Us 2 or Spec Ops: The Line when we praise movies like The Joker, which can draw out many emotional similarities. Joker is a fantastic film, and it makes the viewer feel uneasy. It's not a fun movie to watch, yet it receives praise because we know that the storytelling is not just for entertainment, but for defining cultures. I believe that if a story can make you think about it for hours on end after reaching the end, then the story has succeeded, but this is very subjective. The reason I cannot say if Spec Ops or The Last of Us 2 succeeded or failed is because both of these games tell very subjective and depressing stories. Some will love it, some will give up on it, and both are valid options. Storytelling in video games is something very fascinating and expansive. There's still so much more room for this style of storytelling to evolve, expand, and grow, and I cannot wait to see what happens in the future.